The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone who has joined us so far today. We're thankful that you've taken the time to join for this webinar today. We'll get started maybe just in about 1 minute or so. We'll allow some other people to join. If you are new to GoToWebinar, which is the service we're using for this webinar, I just wanted to give you a little information about using it and interacting as part of this webinar. Our colleague, Morten Warendorf, will be presenting today. He's at the University of Dusseldorf, and he's going to be talking about kind of two new particular data sets that we've built. And it's kind of this project that we've been working on at the Gateway to Global Aging Data to really incorporate these life history interviews, which are asked as many of the HRS sister studies, to incorporate those into kind of harmonized data sets so that they're easily accessible and usable to researchers. So if you have a question throughout this webinar, we're going to answer questions at the end of today's webinar. I think the webinar should run around 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. So you can ask that question in the questions panel of GoToWebinar, and you can ask that at any time. I think we'll look through those at the end and begin to answer those. So you could also just wait until the end and ask your question then. There will be a recording of today's webinar. We'll also provide the slides and the data code used as an example for today's webinar on the Gateway to Global Aging Data that will hopefully be up within about 24 hours after the time of the webinar. And you will get an email tomorrow providing you the link to where to find that data. But you could always go to the Gateway, which is www.g2aging.org. All right, so I think without further ado, I'll go ahead and let Morten take over from here. Thank you again all for joining.
Yes, thank you, Tristan, for introducing me to this webinar, and welcome to everyone. I'm really happy to present this harmonized life history data from the Gateway that we have now prepared during the past months. The data that we harmonize here are data from Cher and ELSA. And yes, I basically want to do two things with you today. And the first thing is that I want to introduce the data. And one thing that I want to stress here in particular is also the way how this data have been collected. Because as most of you may assume, collecting this retrospective data is quite a challenging task, and that's why I'd like to talk a bit about the way how it was done in Cher and in ELSA. And another reason why I want to talk about the way how these calendar interviews have collected the life history data is because it also shows us how the data have been stored in the raw data of Cher and ELSA. And as part of this harmonization process, we not only harmonize the data, but we also restructured somehow the way how the data have been stored originally into the sequence data, which is a different format than the original data format. And for me, it's important to also make this point. And then secondly, I'd like to give some examples of using the data, and here we will combine the data from Cher and from ELSA and run some simple examples, illustrating the potential or the opportunities of this two harmonized life history data. So just to start, I don't think that I need to describe this in detail, but as most of you may be aware, there are increasing number of HRS family surveys that not only collect data that refer to the current circumstances, but they also collect retrospective life history interviews where participants provide retrospective information about their lives before they enter the study. And a reason why they did so is because this allows us also not only to study previous life courses, but also to study the links with later life. And here, in particular, the situation that the older participants have in SHARE or in ELSA. And what you see here on the right side of my slide are, yes, the countries that participate in each of the study. So ELDA covers England and SHARE covers mainland European countries. I mentioned the retrospective survey, and the data we harmonized here in the frame of the Gateway project are specifically Wave 3 data from ELSA and Wave 3 data also from SHARE. In SHARE, people like to call this the SHARE Live interview that was conducted in place of a regular interview where current circumstances were assessed. And the third interview was, the third wave was also the wave where ELSA collected retrospective information. And the point about this retrospective surveys is that they collect data that also refer to previous life stages. And a key instrument that was used as part of this life history interviews is the so-called LiveGrid or calendar interview, which is a specific technique to collect this retrospective information, which is quite challenging, as I just stated. And this includes detailed information of histories for 5 key domains. And here I have a picture of how it was finally done also within the interviews. And this is a screenshot of, the screen that people or interviewer had in front of them as part of the interview. And what you see here is that you have these 5 dimensions that were covered in the life history interviews. And the 5 dimensions here are children as first dimension, partners, accommodation, job, and health. And the good thing, or the thing that differs, I think, to regular surveys or interviews, is that people are not just sitting next to each other and asking questions that are immediately responded, but based on this calendar, which is filled during the interview, they somehow reconstructed also the life course, and this really helped to increase the quality of the collected retrospective data. So just to give you an example, we had, for example, in the interview, they collected information on each job that people had in their previous life course, and the information of the jobs include specifically the start of the spell, so whether the job started, for example, 1968 or 1969, and then beside of that, people also answered or gave information on the end of the spell. And then we also had information about details that describe the spell itself. And here in the example, these are details of each jobs. And yes, whether it was full or part-time, whether people were employed or self-employed in this job, etc. In case of job, it's of course not only important to consider paid employment, but also to consider periods between jobs. And for that reason, people also gave information on gaps between 2 jobs. And this also includes, of course, the starting and the ending date, but then also the reason for this gap, whether it was due to unemployment, because they were looking for home, or family, retired from work, education, etc. And this is now the example for jobs, and as you can imagine, this was done repeatedly for each job that was part of the interview, but also for each gap that was part of the interview. And in SHARE, we had up to 20 different job spells that were reported on that basis. And I here illustrated the example of jobs, but you also could do the same for other dimension here, for example, for accommodation or for partnerships, when they started, when they ended, etc., etc. But we will focus in the example also on the analysis on employment histories. And I just wanted to illustrate the way how we collected it, because at the end, this leads to a complex data set where we have information that is provided in a wide spell format. And this wide spell format is a format where you have repeated information for each job spell that the respondent reported. And as I just said, in some cases, people reported 20 job spells. In the other case, they may only have reported 2 job spells. So this is quite complex. And here I just give a very simplified examples of how this format was coded in the raw data. So you have 2 observations here, ID1 and ID2. In the first instance, we have an observation that has first job that started in 1963, it ended 1965, and he was employed in these jobs. And then he had a second job that started right after the first job, and that started in 1965 till 1970. And in that case, he was self-employed. And the second observation just has 1 job. Yeah? If you take this wide spell format, I think it's quite difficult to derive simple measures, for example, like employment situation at the age of 20, because in some cases, the information on the employment situation at the age of 20 would be found in the 3rd job. In the other case, it would be found in the 15th job, etc. So it is rather a complicated data structure, I would say. And that's the reason why for the Gateway harmonized life history data, we decided to facilitate the use of life history data by rearranging this spell information in a more intuitive state sequence format, where you have 1 state variable for each age. So for example, you have the work state at the age of 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. And if we now take this state for state sequence format, it looks a bit differently. And again, here I have a simplified example where we have a state variable that refers to the age of 20, here a state variable that refers to the age of 21, etc., etc. So for each age, we directly can describe the employment situation. Yes, so this state sequence compared to this wide spell format directly allows to describe conditions at a specific age without need of extensive data management, and hopefully the community and those who download or who will use the data from the Gateway, this will help them to use them. Another thing that I need to mention is that this state sequence format is the standard format for sequence analysis. And some of you may be interested in applying sequence analysis. And hopefully this will be easier with this data set compared to the YSpell format. But one thing that I need to mention, it's not a but, I think it's another point that I need to say here, that we harmonize this life history data for 5 histories, or for all the 5 histories that exist or that are covered in Shared ELSA. And this is not only work, as I describe here as an example, but equally also partnership, children, housing, and health. And for each of this dimension, we have then this sequential data that exists in the 2 surveys. Just to give you the example, or to representation of a sequence where each letter represents a specific state. And we not only have these 2 states, as I illustrated before, but we decided to distinguish 8 different employment situations, starting from employed full-time, to employed part-time, self-employed, unemployed, home family work, retired, full-time education, and then a remaining category of other. And in the first sequence here, you see a man that was 4 years in full-time education, and then he had a very, very long spell of full-time employment, and at the end of his working career, he retired. And for me, the important point to do here is that we have this whole sequence for each respondent that is part of the data set. So if you combine Cher and Elsa, we have 36,000 or more than 36,000 respondents that provide this information. And this definitely allows to describe whole sequences for each participant of the 2 surveys, and it also makes full use of the longitudinal nature of the provided life history data. So another way of presenting the data is what I am showing now here on this slide. And for me, it's a very intuitive way of presenting the richness of the data that results from this life history information that we collect. So we see here the proportion in a specific, or in the 8 states that I just showed, from the age of 15 to the age of 65. And we did distinguish men and women. And we see that most men were in full-time employment throughout their employment career here from age 15 to the age of 65. And we have here at the beginning maybe a proportion of others with a small heap here. This is probably military service. And we also see that a large fraction also were working as self-employed, but there's hardly any proportion here belonging to the darker green, which is employed part-time. But in case of women, it definitely represents a proportion. And in case of women, the most striking thing that we find here, of course, is that we have a large proportion of women who did home or family work throughout their working life. So I think that this chronogram, as we call it, gives an impression about the richness of the data that can be produced based on those life history information. What did we do? I already mentioned that we created 5 histories for each of the 5 domains covered in the interview. But now I want briefly also say something about the variable names, which, as in the other parts of the gateway, follow a consistent pattern. And in case of the life history data, we have a variable name that will be, for example, work state 45. And in that case, the first part indicates the domain to which the variable belongs, and the second part then describes the age to which the domain refers. So in that case, we have the employment situation at the age of 45. Another thing refers to the sequence length, so the question which ages are covered by all this life history information. And the life history interview started with things describing age of 15, and that's why the sequence length that we cover in the data ranges from the age of 15 till the age of 80, or in case a person is younger, of course, then the sequence lasts till the age of the interview. Because we don't have information referring to the age of 80 if a person is only 75, of course. Further details on naming convention, but also details on how precisely we harmonized and constructed the data are described in the code books that are also available online. But now, just also some information to the remaining histories that are covered in the data set. So I already mentioned the work dimension and the 8 categories that combine details on paid work and periods of not working. But beside of that, we also have histories of children. And here we have total and number of children aged younger than 18 years. And this is something that is important, I think, to understand why we have this two type of children information. So in the first case, when we just have the total number, we just describe the total number that people have, the total number of children that people have at a specific age. So for example, a person that is at the age of 70 and who had 5 children in their life, he will have a value 5. But the other thing is that we also counted the number that have a specific age. So for example, the same person that I just described, being age 70 with 5 children, he probably doesn't have children that are age younger than 18 at the age of 70. So I think that the second measure counts the number that are a specific age is also an important variable that is part of this children history. In case of children, we basically distinguish between living alone or living with a partner, regardless of the marital status. In case of housing, we have 5 housing categories that we could distinguish or harmonize between the 2 data sets, and this distinguish whether they are renting the house, whether they are homeowner, whether they are living abroad, whether they are still living in parental housing, and then we have also a 5th category, which is non-private housing. Finally, health, the last dimension covered in the life history interview. In that case, people were asked whether they had periods of ill health or disability, and again, we could identify the age at which this period occurred. Yeah? But it is definitely not a very, very specific health indicator. So we just know whether they were ill or disabled, but details regarding specific diseases, I think these are better covered in the other waves of share and of health. So I just already mentioned the code books, and you find more details in the code books that are downloadable on the gateway. This is the code book for the harmonized share life history documentation, and then you also have the harmonized ELSA life history documentation. And what is nice also about the ELSA documentation, that we also describe the differences between the 2 surveys. And yeah, this is all described there. You can go on the gateway. You find firstly the code books that I just mentioned. This can be found here. And then secondly, you can already download the Stata programs, and this can then be used to generate the harmonized data set from the studies data file. And in due time, also the created life history data will be downloadable in case of ELSA from the from the website that hosts ELSA data. So that's basically what I wanted to say as an introduction to those life history data. And now I like to start with examples of data analysis using the combined life history data from the 2 surveys. And as Dristan said at the beginning, we will provide the do files that I will be running here on the website from Global Aging Data, and we will also provide the presentation. So hopefully using both things, you will be able to reproduce the things that I'm running here. For this, I switch to Stata, which I have here, and I hope that the font size is large enough that all of you can read it. What I will do now is open a do file where all the examples that I will run are collected. So the first thing I like to do with you, and this is something that you also find on the slides, is that I will combine the data with variable from both harmonized data sets or from shared ELSA. The second thing I'd like to do is just to do some manipulation of the variables that I will use later on. Then to explore different state variables, just to give you an impression of the data set. And then we'll start asking some questions. And the first question we'd like to stress here is if the employment situation at the age of 40 vary by gender and how this also varies by country. And as finally the first, at the end of the first examples, I'd like to show you whether, or to ask the question whether the proportion of full-time employment vary by partnership situation at the age of 40. So it may be possible that people are less likely to work in case that their partner is, or in case that they have a partner, yeah? And whether this differs by gender. So let me switch to Stata. And as I said, codes will be available. So if some things are a bit too fast, I'm sure that you will be able to replicate it on the basis of the data, of the do files that we will offer on the website. So the first thing I do is just to tell Stata where my harmonized data are. In my case, I put them both in the folder data on C, and then I just open the share data set, and I will append the ELSA data set. And because the variable names are almost the same, specifically the harmonized variable names, I will also have, yes, the same variable names for both share and ELSA. So here on the right side, you already can see the combined data set of shared ELSA. And if we go through the variable list here, we see that there's a large number, for example, of work state variable. And going down, we will see the same here for partnership state. And we have the children state for each age from age 15 till age 80. And for the other children variable that I described, the total number at a specific age. Then we have here the health state, and finally the residential stage or accommodation history that we also have as part of, yes, that are also part of it. Here I just create some variables that I will use later on, and I will not comment on it, but I basically use, or I basically assign all the different country names. I also create a variable to which survey the observation belongs. And a nice thing here that I do here is also to create a variable of different cohorts. So asking at what age, year, calendar year people were born. Then I just do some simple reordering to have a data set that looks a bit easier. So I just can run this from the beginning till here. And now I have here the data set. So the first thing I'd like to do after combining data, preparing the variables, is just to explore the different state variable. And this won't take very long, but a very simple thing that I can do is, for example, to describe the work state age of 20. And you see here now immediately the distribution of the employment situation for age 20. And we see that 12% of the observation are in home or family work, 53% are already in full-time employment. Yeah? We can ask the same, of course, for the age of 40. And here we have, yes, respective picture that you see here. And the question now, or just to show another example, we also have the variable here, partnership state, and we see that at age of 40, almost 90% of the participants were living with a partner. Yes. So here we can now ask the question, how does the employment situation at age 40 vary by gender? And I just do a simple cross step where I add the variable gender and use the option column percentage. And if I run this, I see that at the age of 40, in case of women, yes, we have 32% of women that are doing home or family work at this age. And in case of men, we only have 32, yes, lonely observation that, yes, had a gap or a job, we're not working and we're working, or not in paid work, but that we're doing home or family work. The other thing we could ask is whether this 32% varies also between country, and this is simply done by this following command. The table that comes up is maybe a bit large, but let's focus here on this fifth column here, which reports the proportion of women in their respective country that are doing home or family work. And we can see that in case of England, these are 25% of the women. But if we could look at Spain, 60% of the women were doing home or family work at the age of 40 in this country. And another example where we see high proportions are Greece, and maybe an example where we see lower proportion are Sweden here, for example. Yeah. So we can do this now also, of course, by partner stage. This is the question I mentioned before. So does the proportion of men, women in full-time employment vary by partnership situation? And I do this here by gender. And if we run this command and we first focus on the table for men, which is here at the top, we can see that in case men are living alone or living with a partner, there are hardly any differences between being employed full-time or not. You know, so in both cases, more than 70% report full-time employment, or if we also add the self-employed, we even have larger proportions. So nearly, yes, 95% of men were working at this age. And let's look now how the picture is in case of women, and we see it's definitely different. So in case women live with a partner, the proportion is 35% or 34%, and in case they live alone, then proportion are much higher. So it's more likely that women probably have stopped working at this ages because their partner, or in case that the partner worked. Of course, we need to add here things like a number of children, maybe specifically also a number of children that are younger than 18, because then they have caring responsibilities or things like that. So these are all questions we can address already, I think, with this very simple state variable. So this is basically what I wanted to say as a first instance, or combining data and basics. And the second thing I'd like to do now is to show more explicitly the capacities or the opportunities that we have based on this employment sequences. And again, here we have these employment sequences. And beside doing those cross steps that I just did, we can also do different things. And two things that I like to do next is to derive summary measures based on these sequences. And by summary measures, I mean that we can simply identify specific patterns that we observe as part of these sequences. And one example that we will use here is just to ask whether people have experienced long-term unemployment. And here we identify, or we define long-term unemployment as having at least 3 years of unemployment, or successive years of unemployment. And the second summary measure we want to derive are the years that people spend in specific states. So for each individual, we will calculate the number or the years that they spend in full-time employment, in education, and for each of this state. This is only the tip of the iceberg when we analyze those sequence data. And you also could refine this analysis, and for those who want to apply techniques of sequence analysis and to identify clusters or types of employment histories, this is exactly what you need to do so. Yeah, so let's move back to Stata. And what I will do now here is also to use some commands that are not part of the default commands that Stata exist. So I assume that you are aware about how to add some packages to Stata. And in this case, what we added is the package called SADI, which is the standard sequence analysis package for Stata. And it's been developed by Brendan Halpin. And for those of you who are interested, just look SADI package on Google, and you will find all this information on how to install it, but also how to use it. And we will just use 3 simple examples of this package for now. Let's briefly go through the different things that I like to do before I do this. The first thing I'd like to do is to create a string variable of the employment sequence between age 15 and 65. So I'd like to create this way of representing the sequence that I presented here. And what is quite nice about representing sequences this way is that we then can easily identify specific patterns as part of this string. And in this case, we'll do that to create a variable where the respondents had an episode of long-term unemployment, which we define with at least 3 years between the observation period. And then we also can simply ask whether this this phenomena is more frequent in specific countries. So we will look at the country variations of this variable. And then next, we will create a variable with information on time spent in each of the employment state. And this is what I mentioned as as another summary measure. And what we will then do is to look whether the number of years spent with home or family work vary by gender, vary by cohort as a different variable. This is the one that I created before, and whether this also varies by country. And then we will also use these 3 variables as predictors in a conventional regression model. And finally, I'd like to create, or to show you how to create these chronograms for employment history that I showed before, because I think it's a quite intuitive and nice way of exploring the data. But for sure, there are also many more ways of visualizing sequential data, but this is for people who start working with those data. I think the one who are most intuitive and also most easy to present if you show people what you've been produced as results. So let's start. What I do first is that I restrict, just for a reason of simplicity, my cases to people who are 65 or older, because all the younger people do not have information on sequences from age 15 to 65. This is what I'm doing here. So let's start now with the first example, creating string representation of sequence. And for that, I will use the command stripe that is part of the SADI package. And then very easily, I just add all the different variables that I'd like to be part of the string representation. And here I define the name of the new variable that is created. And an important bit of this command is also here what you find in this option, symbol. And what I basically do here is that I define a symbol that is assigned to each of the category that is part of work state. So the capital W here, that is what people who belong to full-time work will have, etc., etc. So let's run this command, and then we'll see at the end of our data set here that a new variable is created, and I just simply now list the first cases in my data set, and I see that here there's 10 sequences that I have in my data. So if I take here the first instance, this is a person that continuously was doing self-employment, and then he retired, or he retired, it's a man, at the age of 65. So these are nice ways of giving an impression, an intuition of the sequence, but we like to use those those string representation now to create those variables, and for that we will use regular expressions, which are very helpful to explore these strings and to identify specific patterns within those sequences. So if we just use this command, for example, count if regular expression, and then we name the variable, and then we just put here the pattern that we want to identify, Stata will count all the observations that have W followed by at least 3 H's, so full-time employment followed by 3 years of homework, and yes, we see that nearly 4,000 people have this pattern as part of their sequence. And this can also be used here, like we wanted to do it here in our example, to create a variable where the respondents had an episode of long-term unemployment. And yeah, what we do is we first generate a variable where all the observations are assigned 0, and then we simply replace this variable with the value 1 if this pattern here, 3 U's, is observed. Yeah, so let's do that. And at the end of our data set, we will now see another new variable, long-term UN, which is long-term unemployment. And we see that in all the cases, 7% have experienced these 3 years of unemployment. Let's now ask whether this varies by country. And here we have the table, all the countries, row percentage, and we see in England nearly 5% have experienced long-term unemployment in their employment career. But in Germany, the proportion is larger. In Italy, it's also larger, etc., etc. In Greece, it's also quite large. Yeah. So this is basically the first summary measures that I wanted to illustrate, identify specific patterns that we can do. And the second thing is that we will create a variable with information on time spent in each of the employment state. And here again, we will use a command from the SUDI package. And this is not stripe in that case, but this is a variable command called cumuldur. It counts the cumulative duration. And again, we simply put all the state variables we are using behind it. And then he will create, or Stata will create a new variable, which is denoted here, Y work state, and he will add a suffix behind each of the variable referring to the different states that he counts the years spent in. Let me just run this, and then it will become clearer what I just said. So I ran the command, and now we have 8 new variables starting from work state 1, referring to the full-time employment, till work state 8. And I just simply can summarize now the mean duration spent in these 8 states across all observation. And I see that for the whole sample, 23 years were on average spent in full-time employment. And in case of work stage 5, which is home or family work, I see that the average are 10 years or 10.5 years spent in these categories. So standard deviation, min, that's all the range, is also shown in this table. Another way of showing this thing is, of course, to create a graphical representation. I just now briefly create a bar chart here, and we have here men and for women, men and women. And similarly as before, when we just focused on the age of 40 and the employment situation, now we are summarizing those 51 years between age 15 and 65. And we see that on average of this 51 years, men spend more than 30 years in full-time employment. And here, women, the largest, the highest value is found for home or family work. Yeah. So this is the example of creating the second summary measure, which is just counting the years spent in the different states. So starting from that, we also can create some tables. And I mean, we already visualize these findings by gender, but we also, of course, could create a table where we also find then the respective findings. Here we have table gender and the average years spent in stage 5. And here the respective value are 19 years for women and hardly any years for men. And the total is 10 years across both gender. Another thing that's, I think, quite interesting is also to ask whether this years spent in home or family work varies by cohort. Let's do that here as well. And here we see that if we compare the two cohorts, these are the older cohorts and these who were born later. And we see that if we compare both cohorts for women, that the younger cohorts on average spend less in home or family work compared to those who were born before 1935. Yeah, we can do the same also by country, of course. And then we'll see that it's a similar picture as before, but we see again that countries like Spain or countries like Greece, or the more family-oriented countries, are also those where women spend on average more years with home or family work. In case of men, we hardly can ignore this findings. Yeah, so I think that you got the point. And again, I create now here a horizontal bar where I summarize this finding, and we see for all countries, this is now focused on women, that the average year spent in home or family work is smaller in younger cohorts and larger in older cohorts, but still that there are also quite important country variations. The exercise, or the reason why we are running this exercise, of course, can principally be to describe life courses, but another reason is that we can derive those measures and then relate them, or to study the links to other aspects. And what we could do now here is to add a health indicator and to predict it by these summary measures we created. And all the harmonized data have also the necessary merge ID or ID unique, which are the variables you use to merge information to other waves of ELSA or of share. So you can link information on health or merge information on health to these things. Or you can also predict the summary measures as we did here by specific variables. And what I'm doing here is just running a simple regression, predicting the years that people spent in home or family work, and we see that on average women spend 20 year more in home or family work. We definitely again see country variations. I also include an interaction here between gender and cohort, and I find this quite interesting because it shows us that this cohort effect only exists for women, but not for men. Yeah, I won't comment too much on these findings, but I think you get the idea that we not only can use this variable in tables, but also as part of regression measures, either to predict health by merging this information for other ways, or we can use those summary measures to be predicted, so as dependent variables in other methods. And finally, one last thing I'd like to show is how to create those chronograms. And this is basically done by a chronogram, again followed by the states that I'd like to refer to. So it has the same logic as the commands before. If you install the study package and you have the newest version, then it may be necessary also to include SD in front of all these commands, but basically this chronogram here may work. And yeah, the picture that will be generated is then the following, and this is exactly the same chronogram that I showed before, just with different colors. These are now the standard colors of Stata, and the picture is the same. So yeah, that's it basically regarding the examples that I wanted to show. First, a very simple example of combining the data and giving you an impression of the availability of different states and how the data is structured in the state sequence format. And the second example is the creation of summary measures and some simple visualization. And from here on, we can continue also of applying other techniques. These are just the graphs that I created. And just to sum up before we start the question and answer sessions, I hope that you realize that life history allows or enables an in-depth study of entire previous life courses, but that we think from the gateway that the provided data in a spell format are not that easy to handle, and therefore we hope that the provided state sequence format for the 5 lie domains are easier to use, and this data allow an in-depth study of life courses, but also, as I showed here, the identification of specific patterns, so summary measures, and it is the standard format for further methods. So that's it basically from my side. Please feel free to ask questions, and I'm happy to answer them. If you have if you'd like to find more information, go to the website or drop us an email. A last announcement I'd like to do here is that for those of you who are around in Europe or in the States this year at different conferences, we will also organize some workshops as part of these conferences, namely the GSA that will take place, I think, in Houston this year. And then there will also be a conference of the SLLS, which is the Society for Life Course and Longitudinal Study. And here also we will run a workshop using those data and showing more in-depth examples of sequence analysis. And same also for a small German Congress that we are happy to organize ourselves here in Düsseldorf, to which we also are invited, of course. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Morten. That was very informative. So if people have questions, I encourage you to ask them in the question panel. So currently, I think that we have 2 questions. So the first question by Jing Wu is, I wonder if Charles has also harmonized life history data. I can partly answer this. Yes. So Charles did include a life history interview. I think they referred to it as wave 3 inside of Charles. It was kind of an off year. It was an in between regular core waves. They didn't skip one. They just added an entire survey. And we do have plans to harmonize that as much as possible with the harmonized ELSA and harmonized share that Morten presented here today. We don't quite have a time frame for that though. So I would certainly say it would be, if it was this year, it would be towards the end of this year, I would assume. And also Charles's life history interview was somewhat different than Share and Elsa, which we saw today. And maybe Morten, maybe you could say a little bit about those differences. That might be helpful.
You mean differences between Charles and Share and Elsa?
Right. Yeah. In the life history interview.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely aim, in case the plan is to harmonize the data as far as possible, as Tristan just mentioned. But for obvious reasons, for example, if you take the accommodation histories, we have different details that are asked in China compared with Share and Elsa. And yeah, so my impression, I don't have all the details in mind, is that the life history interview in Charles is even more detailed than what we have in Share and Elsa.
Thank you. The second question is from Jose. Is the harmonized data set weighted and stratified? Do we need to use SVY set, which is a stata command, before using it?
Thank you. This is a very good question. And if you download or if you create the data, you will actually find all the necessary weights as part of the harmonized data. So you will be able to apply them. In the examples that I showed here, I didn't use them. And I think there are also instances where it's important to use them, but there are also instances where it's not necessarily important to use them. And for most of the things that we are doing, if we want sequence analysis, for example, when we estimate the differences between sequences, then we do not need them. But for the tables that are presented here, you can also some recommend to use them, some don't, but they are part of the data set and they easily can be implemented for the analysis.
We have another question from Rumi Yang, which is, could you recommend additional resources for sequence analysis?
Yeah, I can. Drop me an email and I'm happy to answer it. And yeah, I think it depends a bit which data, or I always like to start using statistical techniques by running an own example and running an own software package as well. And if you do it with Stata, I definitely would recommend to use the SADI package because it's very intuitive and the documentation is really good. But this is more the technical introduction to this sequence analysis. If you want to have more technical or more conceptual, a more statistical introduction, then there are definitely also papers or literature I can recommend. Send me an email and I'm happy to answer it.
Perfect. That was helpful. And Morten, I dropped your email as an answer to that question, so that they have your email. We have one question through email. This is through Mary McHenry, and she said, She was wondering about the completeness of the data. How much missing data is there, and how complete are they?
Yeah, very good point. That we actually had very good experiences in that respect, and we think that is related to this calendar interview that I showed. And this more or less also assures that we first do not necessarily have implausible responses. So people couldn't report the end of a job before their year of birth, for example. And in addition to that, it really also assured this calendar interview that it was more or less filled entirely by all the respondents. Still, we have some missings. And there are definitely also techniques that could be applied to fill these missings that go beyond yes, the usual imputation techniques that we know from other variables. So there's a special literature also on imputing sequential data. So in that case, you would also take, for example, information before and after the missing period. And this is something that could be done with the data, but to be honest, we haven't imputed them so far because the amount of missing was not very large.
Thank you, Morten. I think that was helpful. Yeah, of course, in survey data, missing values are something we always think about. I will also just briefly say that I think both, and you can correct me, Morten, here, both Cher and Elsa basically aimed to include their full sample in the life history interview. So everyone who had been part of the interview before is in wave 2 for both of these was hopefully included at wave 3. So yes. it is fairly a full sample. You don't have a lot of, and I think they got decent response rates also. So it's around yes. what their sample is for the core interviews. Yes.
Yes, the interviewers reported positive, or the way how they, yes, thought about the interview is that the interviewed people actually liked the interview because they like to talk about their life. Yeah. And another aspect I'd like to add here is that the harmonized data of the gateway include wave 3 data of ELSA and wave 3 data of Cher. But they recently also had was a release of Cher data from wave 7. And here also you have Cher life information. Again, the plan is here to include them in future yes, releases of the gateway.
Thank you. So Edison Vidal just said that he was not able to watch the first 15 minutes. Can I repeat how you'll be able to access the recording of the full lecture? So yes, so we have a recording of today's webinar, including these questions. We also will provide the slides and this data code that Morten used today. That will be available on the Gateway to Global Aging Data. That website is g2aging.org within the next 24 hours, and it's on the documentation page, and that will be under recent presentations. Tomorrow, also, you'll get a follow-up email after this webinar that will provide you a link specifically to those files. And then we have another question from Rumei Wang, which is, are these two data sets compatible with Charles, specifically life history? Thank you. We touched a little bit on this before, but maybe Morten, is there anything else you'd like to say on this?
To the extent to which is possible, I think we will try to harmonize them. But harmonizing also means that we have to find or that we have also to lose information that may be more detailed in a specific survey. But I think that the harmonized data we have here, Cher and ELSA, are largely comparable. And the extent to which this will also be possible with Charles is something we will have to answer in the future.
Thank you. I have not. I'm not seeing any other questions. If anyone else has questions, we'll happy to stay online for a little while longer and answer them.
If not, feel free to write us an email. Yeah.
Certainly, and maybe Morten, do you want to just put up your last slide again, which has the emails for more help or information? Yes. Yeah, so if you think of a question later or you review the webinar, the slides, and have a question, you can certainly contact us there. Okay, well, I think we can probably go ahead and call it. Again, thank you everyone for joining. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Morten, thank you again for providing all this information.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Certainly. All right, well, everyone take care.
Bye.
Goodbye.